So we introduce Mr. George Malina, our treasurer, for our third quarter's treasurer's report.
Thank you and good evening. 2 weeks ago, as I was watching our youngest son go through graduation ceremonies, I couldn't help but think about my own West High graduation ceremonies 31 years beforehand. In particular, I kind of thought about my perspective in how I think about public education and how it's transitioned from when I was a student to a homeowner to a parent and now the board treasurer. And it's interesting to me that the economic climate of the late 70s and early 80s is really not a whole lot different than what we're experiencing today. 1979 brought about the second energy crisis. Bank failures were rising. And in December of 1982, unemployment rate was at 10.8%. While there's certainly differences in some of the economic components that affected everybody at that time compared to now, the feeling of the people that are involved, the homeowners, the parents of our community, is very similar. When I was a student, I assumed that if I worked hard at school and took advantage of as many learning opportunities as I had, I would be well prepared for college as well as my career. When we became homeowners for the first time in 1989, I felt for the first time public education because I saw it in detail in my property tax bill. We became West Aurora School District parents in 2005 with the opening of Herget Middle School and our choice to move our kids from parochial education to public education where we thought they would have the best opportunity for learning. But it wasn't until I had this opportunity to be board treasurer that I really started to grasp, and I still don't completely grasp, all the complexities involved in the financial side of public education. While we can feel the impact and the costs of public education, perhaps most at the local level, the costs do begin at the federal level. In my profession, I do a lot of tax work, and I see how the federal government attempts to manage, manipulate, whatever word you want to use, behavior through tax code. And public education isn't different from that. U.S. public education, in my opinion, seems to, in part, be driven by the goals of our country from an economic standpoint. How do we remain as an economic superpower? How do we make sure that we have the right people at the right place as we continue on in our country and want to maintain our status in the world? I was a product of the space race. The children going through education today are part of No Student Left Behind. And while the federal government may establish the policies and the procedures, and to some extent the funding of public education, it demands the achievement and accountability, but it leaves the methods to accomplish those goals to the states. And the states are in kind of a unique situation because in addition to addressing the demands placed on them from the federal government, they also have to fill in the gaps for the things that aren't critical to what the lawmakers in Washington decide are important, with all the other things that we as an educational community feel are important for our children. And in states like Illinois, where a lot of the costs are being pushed to the local tax level, we wind up with a group of unfunded mandates. And at the end of the day, whether the funds come from the federal government, the state government, or the local government, it really only has one source, and that's the taxpayers. In pushing an obligation or a group of obligations from one taxing entity to another really does nothing to solve the problems. All it does is push it from one entity to another, and while that may be politically comfortable for those legislators to do, it still doesn't tackle the root of the problems. And it's no secret that Illinois is struggling. And that in turn creates challenges for school districts. And anticipating what is going to be coming for us in the next year, it's quite possible that we're going to be facing a budget deficit. And we're going to pay for that with the small amount of funds that we have sitting in reserves. and there's not a whole lot to spare. The Illinois fiscal year 13 budget contains several items that are of great concern. We have the reduced funding for the reimbursements, money we've already spent, to the district for free breakfast and lunch, early childhood, bilingual and special education. We have, and I like the way they phrase this, an increase in the proration. Read that as a reduction for the general state aid from 95% to 89%, which effectively is going to wipe out any benefit financially that we expected from the all-day kindergarten program. And then we also have the discussion of the change in the pension funding, the attempt to push that from a state responsibility to the local responsibility. And I feel and understand what our district families are feeling and seeing in their property tax bills. But unfortunately, there's not a lot of control that we have in that. We have the same costs, and we still need to educate our children. We still need to accomplish all the things that are important to us as a community, and we need to get those dollars from somewhere. At the federal level, we had a bipartisan deficit reduction super committee that failed in their task to come up with $1.2 trillion in savings over 10 years, which automatically triggers a across-the-board cut in all discretionary funding. And while we here may not feel that education is discretionary, from the federal level it is. And so we're potentially facing a 9% cut in the federal portion of our funding. And that could represent somewhere in the neighborhood of $4 billion countrywide in 2013 alone. And it's quite possible that nothing will be done to correct that until after the presidential election. And how inconvenient is that? That's 2 months after school starts. So with that, I'd like to go through the Treasurer's report for the third quarter. No big surprises here. That's one positive thing about the district, is that the district has done a very good job of anticipating the challenges, being conservative in the budgeting process, and while the numbers may not always be what we want them to be, and the timing of the payments may not be what we expect them to be, at least there aren't any big surprises. On the revenue side, the only big pieces to point out were the blip in January, where the first quarter mandated categorical and other state grant programs payments were received. $800,000 came in from the National School Lunch Program, and $1 million in Individuals with Disabilities Education Act federal funding. On the expense side, nothing out of the ordinary here, with just the comment that if you notice on the August and February bars, we had the payments for the debt service and the interest, but those are to be expected. On the recap of the revenue and expense, again, it does represent, for those folks who are seeing this for the first time, the challenges that the district faces in receiving money in really two very large chunks, and then dealing with that budget process through the balance of the year. On the revenue and expenditures chart, one point here that I'd like to mention is that on the expense category, you'll notice that the encumbered column is blank. And again, the encumbered column represents those expenditures that have already been spoken for. They're non-operational type expenses where we have a commitment already to make those payments, and we don't have the ability to spend or not spend those funds in the balance. Christy is working with the new accounting system to make sure that she has 100% confidence in those numbers before we present those. And for my final report for fiscal year 2012, I will have those numbers in the encumbered column. But again, no surprises here. We also expect that in the next report, or perhaps the one following, that we'll have the projection of the cash balances. Right now, our funds are pooled with the other districts that are part of the program, and picking out our piece of the pie for presentation and projections has proved to be a little bit more difficult than expected. But Christy put in the outstanding grant payments report here, which was current as of about 2 weeks ago, and it shows that we're owed about $6 million. Seems to be a pretty consistent number this year. Any questions that I might answer at this time? Well, thank you.
Thank you, George.